They thought she was just a weak, helpless black woman, but the truth left the entire courtroom in shock. On an ordinary morning, Amelia Carter drove to work, unaware that she was about to become the victim of a blatant abuse of power. Two police officers pulled her over for no reason, searched her vehicle without cause, and falsely accused her of resisting arrest. They thought she was just an average citizen who could be forced into a wrongful case with no one ever knowing. But what they didn't realize was that Amelia was a federal prosecutor, and she wasn't about to stay silent. The gray skies of the early morning seemed to signal something ominous. Amelia Carter sipped her cold coffee as she drove out of the small apartment complex where she lived. The streets of Brooklyn were still sparsely populated, but the city's energy never truly felt quiet. The blaring horns, the hurried footsteps, and the fragmented conversations formed a familiar rhythm of urban life. She turned on the radio. A smooth jazz tune filled the car, offering a bit of relaxation before a busy day at the federal prosecutor's office. But as soon as she turned onto the main road heading towards Manhattan, an uneasy feeling crept up in her chest. From her rearview mirror, she noticed a police patrol car following her, not too far behind. She checked her speed to make sure she was still within the legal limit. No violations, no red lights, no wrong lanes. But the patrol car continued to tail her, its lights still off, yet its presence enough to make Amelia feel tense. She took a deep breath, trying to push away the worry creeping into her mind. Maybe they were just heading the same way. She stayed calm, eyes fixed on the road ahead, but instinctively glanced at the rearview mirror again. It was still there. Two officers sat inside, their faces obscured by tinted windows, but their posture made her uneasy. A chill ran down her spine, and a strange intuition stirred within her, warning that something wasn't right. There had been so many stories about people like her, black individuals who were pulled over for no reason, interrogated, and even attacked simply because their existence made someone feel uncomfortable. Amelia was no stranger to these stories. She had read hundreds of files about cases involving police discrimination, but she never imagined she would become the protagonist in one of those situations. Still, her rational mind tried to reassure her. It could just be a coincidence. Maybe they were just patrolling. But her intuition disagreed. She was used to analyzing situations, to picking up on faint yet suspicious signs, and right now, all her senses were telling her this wasn't a normal patrol. The engine sound behind her continued to follow her through each turn. Amelia deliberately changed lanes, but the patrol car did the same. At this point, there was no more doubt. They were targeting her. A wave of cold air ran down her back as she realized it. Why? She hadn't done anything wrong, had shown no signs of violation. But that had never mattered when you were a black person on the streets of America. Her grip tightened on the steering wheel, her knuckles turning white with pressure. She reminded herself to stay calm, to control her breathing, but her heart was racing faster than usual. She thought back to the lessons her parents taught her as a child, the warnings every black family must pass on to their children. Keep your hands on the wheel. Don't make sudden moves. Don't argue. Keep your tone calm. Amelia had memorized those rules as a child, but she never thought she'd have to apply them in a situation like this. She glanced quickly at the car's clock. Only 15 minutes until she'd reach the office, but it seemed she wouldn't make it that far. A flash of red and blue lights from the car behind, followed by a blaring siren, shattered the morning stillness. She gritted her teeth. There was no turning back now. No matter what they wanted, she would soon have to face it. And Amelia knew all too well, in this situation, no matter what she did, there was no guarantee she would walk away from this confrontation unscathed. Amelia took a deep breath, trying to maintain her composure as she glanced in the rearview mirror. The police car door swung open, and two men stepped out, walking slowly yet deliberately. A heavy weight pressed down on her chest, as if the air around her had suddenly thickened. She had seen this type of person hundreds of times. Officers with absolute confidence, believing they were the law itself, that they could do anything without explanation. The first, William Tate, was tall and lean but solid. His short, neat blonde hair and sharp facial features gave him a stern appearance. But what caught Amelia's attention were his eyes, cold, judgmental, as though he was assessing who she was, what she was worth, and whether she deserved to be treated as a human being. He moved with deliberate slowness, his hand resting on his belt where his gun and handcuffs gleamed in the morning light. He wasn't in a hurry, wasn't tense. He was only concerned with savoring the absolute power he wielded. Beside him, Daniel Ross was completely different. Shorter, but with a muscular frame, broad shoulders, and a large gut suggesting he spent more time in fast food joints than on patrol. His face was flushed, perhaps from the cold, or simply from a habit of anger towards everything. His narrow eyes gleamed with a sick amusement as he approached Amelia's car, as if he had seen hundreds of people like her before, and all of them had ended the same way. Tate approached the car window, leaning down with a smirk. "Show me your papers immediately." His voice held no professionalism or courtesy, just an empty command, not even pretending she had the right to refuse or ask why. Ross stood right behind Tate, his arms crossed over his chest, muscles straining beneath his uniform. He said nothing, but his eyes spoke volumes, a disdain, a smugness, a perverse delight in stepping on others, especially people like Amelia. Amelia looked Tate straight in the eyes, keeping her face expressionless, but inside, a fire was burning. She had encountered men like these her entire life, those who thought their uniform gave them absolute authority, who believed she should be afraid, should submit. But Amelia was not that person. She slowly opened her purse, taking out her wallet. Her fingers tightened around her driver's license as she handed it over to Tate. "Here." She kept her tone calm, but not submissive. Tate took her documents without even looking at them, handing them off to Ross indifferently. Ross glanced over the driver's license, then let out a small laugh, shaking his head as though he'd found something amusing. "Brooklyn, huh? Well, not surprised." Amelia tightened her grip on the steering wheel. She knew exactly what he was implying. Brooklyn, a predominantly black area, a place where, to them, it could only be the home of the undesirables, of those who were to be suspicious. Tate leaned against the car, tapping lightly on the window. "Where are you headed?" Amelia held his gaze, not breaking eye contact. "I'm on my way to work." Ross raised an eyebrow. "Work? What do you do?" Amelia could see they were testing her, trying to figure out if she had a valid reason to be treated decently. They expected her to falter, to show fear, but she would not give them that satisfaction. "I'm a lawyer," she said simply. Tate and Ross exchanged looks. Ross sneered, "A lawyer?" He curled his lip, his tone dripping with mockery. "Let me guess, the kind who does paperwork for drug dealers, right?" Amelia felt anger flare inside her, but she forced herself to stay calm. There was nothing more dangerous than letting them see that they were getting under her skin. "No, I'm a federal prosecutor." Silence hung in the air for a second, just 1 second, before Ross burst into laughter as if he'd just heard the funniest joke of the day. "A prosecutor? You really?" Tate shook his head, not laughing, but his gaze now carried a hint of skepticism. "Which district prosecutor?" Amelia kept her voice even. "The U.S. Department of Justice." Ross immediately stopped laughing. Tate no longer wore the smug look he had before, but instead of showing hesitation or respect, a flicker of discomfort crossed their faces. They didn't like this, not one bit. "Well, Miss Carter," Tate drawled, still trying to maintain his disdain. "Lucky for you, but I still need to check a few things. Step out of the car." At that moment, Amelia realized there was nothing she could say or do to escape this situation. The fact that she was a federal prosecutor didn't make them stop. It only gave them more reason to humiliate her. Amelia's breath slowed as she locked eyes with Tate. She knew there was no other choice. These two men had decided to enjoy their power to the fullest, regardless of how she cooperated. She slowly opened the car door, every movement controlled to avoid giving them any reason to escalate the situation. Still, inside her, the anger began to simmer, growing stronger by the second. As soon as her feet hit the ground, Ross immediately closed in, his large frame blocking all space around her. Tate stood to the side, watching with a cold expression, his hands still resting on his belt near his gun, a silent warning. "Turn around." "Hands on the car," Ross ordered, his voice now devoid of any professionalism, replaced with the twisted delight of someone completely in control of the situation. Amelia knew the law. They had no right to search her without just cause or her consent. But if she refused, she'd seen too many cases start from a legitimate objection only to end in unpredictable violence. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to swallow the humiliation, and slowly turned, placing her hands on the cold metal of the car's hood. Ross didn't wait another second. He shoved into her back, pushing her forward, her cheek pressed against the car's surface. His touch made her entire body tense. She was no longer a federal prosecutor at that moment. She was just another black woman treated like a criminal on the streets. His rough hands slid down her waist, tightening unnecessarily before moving down her legs. He yanked her legs apart, causing her to lose her balance for a brief moment. "Just checking if you're carrying any weapons," he whispered close to her ear, his voice dripping with mockery. Amelia gritted her teeth, her eyes darkening. This was no ordinary search. It was a power game, a test to see if she dared to resist. She glanced to the side, noticing a group of pedestrians on the sidewalk had stopped. Some raised their phones to record the scene, but no one said a word. No one stepped forward. The looks they gave her were filled with pity but also fear. Fear that if they spoke up, they too might become the next target. Ross continued his search, and with each passing second, the humiliation boiled inside Amelia. She knew that if she uttered even a single word of objection, if she moved even the slightest, things could escalate much, much worse. After what felt like an eternity, Ross finally stepped back. "Nothing," he muttered, as if disappointed he hadn't found a reason to take things further. Tate smirked, as if this was no big surprise. "All right, you can stand up. But we're not done yet." Amelia took a deep breath, slowly standing up. The humiliation hadn't left her, but there was one thing keeping her grounded. She would never forget this. She didn't know exactly what Tate and Ross wanted, but one thing she was certain of: they had picked the wrong person to mess with. And though they didn't know it yet, the hatred they had just seeded in her would soon grow into something that would destroy everything they believed they could control. Amelia stood there, her breath steady but her heart racing, as her gaze remained locked with Tate and Ross. The silence between them was more than just a gap of sound. It was an undercurrent of tension, a silent battle of wills, a struggle for control. She could feel it in her bones. They were trying to break her, to make her submit, but she would not give them that satisfaction. She would not let them see her fear. She wouldn't cower. Not now, not ever. Tate took his time pulling out his notepad with exaggerated care, as if savoring the moment, enjoying the control he had over her. He casually flipped through the pages, the sound of paper rustling the only noise that broke the oppressive silence. Then, with a smirk playing on his lips, he began to write, each stroke of the pen slow and deliberate, as though he were crafting some twisted masterpiece of power. "So, speeding," Tate muttered, his voice carrying a sense of false authority, his pen gliding across the page with a mock seriousness. 15 mph over the limit. "A bit fast there, Miss Carter." Amelia's body stiffened, her breath catching slightly in her throat. She knew this wasn't true. She knew she hadn't exceeded the speed limit. They were making this up. She could feel the sting of their lies, but she couldn't react. Not yet, not until the time was right. Tate continued writing, seemingly unaware of the storm brewing inside her. But then, as if sensing her growing frustration, he stopped. He glanced at Ross, a quick, almost imperceptible exchange between them. And then Tate smiled slowly, cruelly, like a cat savoring its kill. "But maybe I should add something else," he said, his voice dripping with malice. Ross leaned forward, his expression a mixture of curiosity and amusement, clearly in on whatever was about to happen. Without warning, he stepped closer to Amelia, his large frame looming over her like a shadow, blocking any possibility of escape. His voice dropped to a near whisper, low enough for Amelia to hear, but too soft for anyone else to confirm. "Someone like her not on her knees? Just keep pushing her into a corner." Amelia froze, her breath caught in her throat as his words registered. Those weren't just casual remarks. Those were threats, direct threats. They weren't merely trying to control the situation. They were trying to break her, to force her into submission. And Amelia knew deep down that if she let them see even the slightest crack in her composure, if she showed even the smallest hint of fear, it would only get worse. They would escalate, and she would be trapped. Tate chuckled softly, the sound barely audible, but chilling nonetheless. He looked over at Ross, nodding as if they were in agreement, before turning back to his notepad. "Resisting arrest," he said, his voice heavy with mock satisfaction. The pen now scratched the paper with deliberate slowness. His handwriting seemed to carve the words into the page, like it was a sentence already written in stone. Amelia's fists clenched so tightly her nails dug into her palms. She could feel the blood rushing to her face, her body tingling with the effort to remain composed. She wasn't going to let them win, not this time. With all the strength she could muster, she lifted her chin, her voice steady but cold. "You just fabricated a charge with no evidence. You really think I'm just going to let this slide?" she asked, her words cutting through the silence like a blade. Tate raised an eyebrow, a mocking smile spreading across his face. He didn't even look at her as he casually tossed the citation toward her, as though it were nothing more than a scrap of paper. "What's done is done. We're just following procedure, Miss Carter," he said, his tone dripping with false politeness, as if the whole thing were a game to him. Ross, standing just behind Tate, burst out laughing, the sound so loud and crude it seemed to fill the entire street. "You can appeal if you want," he said, his voice oozing with scorn. "Just one question. Who's going to believe you?" His eyes gleamed with triumph, as if he had just won the final round of a battle. The laughter rang in Amelia's ears, and she could feel the anger boiling inside her, threatening to explode. For a moment, Amelia didn't respond. She let the silence stretch out, the weight of it heavy in the air. Her heart was racing, her fists still clenched tightly, but she kept her composure. She didn't move, she didn't flinch. She just stared at them, her gaze unblinking, steady, unwavering. They had no idea what they had just done. Amelia didn't need to speak right away. She let the silence build, knowing full well that it was in this moment of stillness that they would feel the weight of her defiance. The truth was, they had underestimated her. They thought they could break her with their intimidation, with their lies, with their threats. But they were wrong. As she stood there, locked in this deadly game of cat and mouse, she knew one thing for certain. This moment would not define her. They thought they had won, but they hadn't. They didn't realize that they had just set in motion the very thing that would destroy them. And as she stood there, unflinching, she made a promise to herself that she would never forget this day, this injustice. She would make sure the world knew what they had done. She would make them regret ever thinking they could control her. The tables would turn, and when they did, they would be the ones trapped in the corner, unable to escape the consequences of their actions. Amelia stood frozen by the roadside, her fingers gripping the citation paper so tightly that its edges crinkled and tore. Her breath still hadn't stabilized, and the humiliation from Ross's brutal search lingered, the heat of it searing her skin. She watched as Tate and Ross turned toward their patrol car, laughing and joking as if this had all been some trivial game. The engine roared to life, and the police car began to roll away slowly. But they didn't leave immediately. They stayed parked there, watching her, as though they wanted to ensure she felt the powerlessness they had just imposed on her. Amelia didn't let them see how deeply they had affected her. Her face remained impassive, though inside a storm raged. When the patrol car finally drove off, she exhaled deeply, pulling out her phone with trembling fingers. She wasn't afraid. She was furious. But she knew she couldn't act right now. She scrolled through her contacts, searching for a name she trusted. Marcus Gray. Marcus wasn't just a colleague. He was one of the few people she knew would understand the gravity of the situation. A skilled lawyer, tough as nails, and more importantly, someone who truly knew how the system worked. If anyone could give her a realistic perspective, it was Marcus. The phone rang once, twice. On the third ring, Marcus's low voice came through. "I'm in the middle of a meeting, Amelia. Is this urgent?" She swallowed the fire building in her throat, forcing her voice to stay calm. "I've just been pulled over by the police. They searched my car and frisked me in the middle of the street. And now I've got a fabricated speeding ticket and a charge of resisting arrest." There was a brief silence. Then Marcus's voice dropped, colder than before. "Who?" "Tate and Ross." Marcus sucked in a breath through his teeth. "Damn those two. They're scum. But listen, Amelia." He paused, his tone shifting to something more serious, more like a warning than just anger on her behalf. "If they've got their sights on you, this might not just be some small-time stunt." Amelia froze. She knew Marcus wasn't easily rattled. If he was saying that, then something bigger was at play. "What do you mean?" Marcus sighed. "Tate and Ross aren't your average officers. They have backing, Amelia. You think about all the complaints filed against them, all of them mysteriously disappearing. Someone's covering for them. And if they're targeting you today, trying to push you into a corner, then very likely, he paused before adding, someone wants to send a message. Cold. A chill ran down Amelia's spine. A message? A warning? But why? I haven't done anything to deserve being targeted, she protested, though her voice wavered slightly. You don't have to do anything, Marcus replied softly. Just existing in your position, doing your job, is enough to make some people uncomfortable. Amelia gritted her teeth. She didn't want to believe it. She didn't want to think that this situation could be so much bigger than she imagined. But Marcus's words echoed in her head, connected to the uneasy feeling she had when she saw the patrol car tailing her. She took a deep breath. I can't let this go. No, you can't, Marcus agreed. But you need to play smart. This isn't something you can solve with a simple internal complaint. You need evidence, Amelia. Evidence that's irrefutable. Evidence. She looked down at the phone in her hand, then glanced around at the street. Some people were still standing there, whispering among themselves, perhaps still in shock from what they had just witnessed. Maybe someone had recorded everything. A flicker of hope sparked in her mind, cutting through the fiery rage burning within her. Marcus, I'll call you back later. She hung up before he could respond, took a deep breath, and walked toward the group of people on the other side of the street. She couldn't strike back right now, but she would. And when the time came, Tate and Ross would regret ever choosing her as their target. Amelia stood there, her hand still gripping the phone, a cold fury rising within her. She felt her heart slow, no longer erratic with fear or surprise. Instead, it became steady, resolute. What Tate and Ross had done was not just an insult. It was a declaration of war, and Amelia had never been one to back down when cornered. She turned and walked toward her car, her eyes briefly scanning the unfamiliar faces on the street. Some people were still there, watching her with silent pity. A few had put their phones away, perhaps having recorded what had just happened but lacking the courage to step forward. Amelia didn't blame them. She understood this silence all too well. She had witnessed it in countless cases she'd been involved with. People who saw injustice but were choked by fear, afraid of being dragged into it themselves. But today, she would not remain silent. Today, she would change the game. She opened the car door, slid into the driver's seat, and slammed the door shut. Her hand rested on the steering wheel, but she didn't start the car just yet. Instead, she looked into the rearview mirror, and that's when she saw them. Tate and Ross. Their patrol car was still parked not far behind her, its lights faintly flashing, a distasteful reminder that they were still here, still in control of the situation. They weren't in a hurry to leave. They were watching. Ross was grinning, a mocking, contemptuous grin. Tate wasn't smiling, but his eyes were quietly assessing, as though studying her reaction, as if deciding whether or not to continue harassing her. Amelia took a long breath, feeling the cold air inside the car, letting the anger settle into complete focus. Men like Tate and Ross always believed they were untouchable. They thought their uniforms were shields, that they could twist the truth, turn victims into criminals with just a few strokes of a pen. They believed their power was absolute, that anyone who opposed them would be crushed under the wheels of the system they served. But what they didn't know was that they had picked the wrong person to mess with. Her eyes remained locked on the rearview mirror as she whispered, as if making a vow to herself, I won't forget. I won't forgive. She pressed the accelerator, pulling away from the scene, but she knew one thing for sure. This game had only just begun. Amelia drove slowly through the crowded streets of Brooklyn, but her mind was no longer focused on the road ahead. Inside her head, everything swirled like a raging storm. What Tate and Ross had done wasn't just a personal abuse of power. It was part of a rotten system, a power game that people like them had been playing for years without fear of punishment. But this time, she wasn't a silent victim. She pulled over to the side of the road, took out her phone, and opened the Notes app, typing down every detail of the incident while her memory was still fresh. The date, time, location, Tate and Ross's words, their behavior. Everything was recorded with precision, not leaving out a single detail. Once she was done, she took a deep breath, scrolled through her contacts, and dialed Marcus Gray. Marcus, I need your help, she said as soon as he picked up. Marcus didn't ask questions. He sighed, his voice heavy with exhaustion but serious. What do you need? Evidence, Amelia said slowly, emphasizing each word. I need to find witnesses. I'm sure someone recorded it. Marcus paused for a moment. I can help search social media to see if anyone posted a video. But you should go back to the scene. If anyone recorded it, they might still be around. Amelia nodded, even though Marcus couldn't see her. I'll go back. She hung up, started the car, and turned it around, heading back toward the street where it all started. When she returned to the scene, the air felt less tense than before, but people were still lingering on the street. Some quickened their pace when she neared, unwilling to get involved. But she needed a witness. And then she saw her, an elderly homeless woman, ragged clothes, huddled by a brick wall of a closed-up shop. She looked gaunt, with a face weathered by sun and wind, but her eyes lit up when they met Amelia's. She had been there the entire time the incident unfolded. Amelia remembered clearly. Amelia walked over, trying not to appear too eager. "Excuse me, may I speak with you for a moment?" The woman furrowed her brow but didn't back away. "You the one they searched earlier, right?" Amelia nodded. "Yes. Did you see what happened?" The woman snorted softly, but there was nothing humorous about her smile. "What do you think? I've seen that happen a dozen times. Those cops always do that. But not to someone like you." Amelia raised an eyebrow. "Someone like me?" The woman grunted, her voice raspy as if she had smoked too much in her life. "What I mean is, someone with standing. Someone with a strong enough voice to stand up to them. But people like me? No one cares." Her words cut into Amelia's mind like a knife. She had known this for a long time. Those without power, without a support system, those with nothing to lose were always the most easily suffocated. But hearing it from a living witness made her feel rage deep to her bones. "Did you get a video?" Amelia asked, her voice dropping low. The woman shook her head. "No phone. But I saw a few kids at the corner there, holding their phones up." Amelia immediately turned her head, her eyes scanning the street. If anyone had recorded it, she had to find them before the police did anything to erase the evidence. They had chosen the wrong person to mess with, and now she would prove it. Amelia slammed the car door so hard it shook the rearview mirror. Her heart was pounding, not out of fear, but from the rage building up in her chest. The words of the homeless woman still echoed in her mind. "They've done this to me a dozen times already." That wasn't just a comment. It was an indictment of the system. Tate and Ross weren't just two bad cops. They were part of a much larger problem. She took out her phone and dialed Marcus Gray. "What have you found?" His voice was lower now, more serious than usual. "I've got a witness," she said quickly. "But I need you to help me look into Tate and Ross. I don't believe this is the first time they've done something like this. I need their records." Marcus was silent for a few seconds before sighing. "You know police internal records aren't easy to access." "I don't need internal records," Amelia interrupted. "Just the public complaints. I want to know how many people have filed complaints against them." Marcus sucked in a breath through his teeth. "All right, give me an hour." Amelia hung up, gripping the steering wheel as her eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead. She had a very bad feeling about this. Nearly an hour later, her phone rang. She picked up immediately. "Amelia," Marcus said, his voice tinged with a hint of concern. "Guess what I found?" "They've done this before," she said firmly. Marcus scoffed. "Not once. Not twice. 5 times." She held her breath. "Tate and Ross have been complained about 5 times in the past 3 years. Excessive force, unlawful detention, racial discrimination, and falsifying a report. But here's the most interesting part." Marcus paused, as if debating whether or not to continue. "Go ahead," Amelia urged. "All 5 complaints were dismissed," he said, his voice dropping lower. "And not just dismissed normally. They were never properly investigated. Each time a complaint was filed, there was a senior figure who stepped in to ensure it didn't go any further." Amelia closed her eyes, trying to control the emotions rising inside her. 5 times. That meant at least 5 people had stood where she was. At least 5 people had been abused, humiliated, threatened by Tate and Ross, but could do nothing but accept their fate. Who had protected them? Who had helped them escape justice time and again? She opened her eyes, her voice now completely steady. "I want to know who dismissed those complaints." Marcus sighed. "I think we both know the answer, Amelia." She didn't need to ask. The police department. Their own department had shielded Tate and Ross. Amelia stared at the rearview mirror, where just a few hours ago, she had seen Ross's challenging gaze. He was used to getting away with it. But this time, he won't get away. Amelia didn't waste another minute. As soon as she had gathered enough information, she drafted a formal complaint to the Department of Justice, detailing everything from the moment she was stopped by the police to the disturbing history of misconduct by Tate and Ross. She attached all the evidence she had gathered, old complaints, witness testimonies, and even the video footage from those who had recorded the incident. Everything was clear, irrefutable. This was no longer just a case of police abuse. It was a systemic issue. If she could take this to the federal level, she could drag the entire corrupt network into the light. But things didn't go as smoothly as she had hoped. Less than 2 days after submitting the complaint, she received a response from federal judge Richard Nolan's office. The complaint was dismissed immediately. No investigation, no review, no indication that anyone had actually looked at the material she had sent. The reason Nolan gave was nothing new. There is insufficient evidence to prove any serious misconduct by the officers. Amelia stared at the line on the screen, feeling as if she had been punched in the chest. If this was a game, the rules had been stacked against her from the very beginning. But what made her realize she had touched something far more dangerous than she had imagined wasn't the judge's decision. It was the message that appeared on her phone that very evening. A strange number, no identity attached, just a single line. "We'll make sure you disappear before you even open your mouth." A chill ran down her spine, not out of fear, but because she knew what this meant. She had done the right thing. She had found the thing they desperately wanted to hide. And now they were starting to strike back. Amelia gripped the phone tightly, her mind quickly shifting into fight mode. She wasn't one to be intimidated easily. If they wanted her to be silent, they had misjudged her from the start. They thought a threat would make her back down, but in reality, it only made her more determined. She stood up, opened her laptop, and started to draft a new plan. If the system wouldn't listen to her from the inside, then she would make the whole world listen. Amelia knew that nothing would be easy, but she didn't expect them to go this far. Just a few days after filing her complaint, she received an official notice from the local court. She was charged with resisting an officer and obstructing justice. As she read the cold, impersonal words, a sense of disbelief swept over her. Her heart pounded, but instead of the panic she would have expected, there was something else: rage. They had turned the tables completely, casting her, the victim, as the criminal. But it wasn't just the charges that stung, it was who was behind them. The prosecutor handling her case was none other than Caroline Whitaker, a woman notorious for always siding with the police, no matter how corrupt they were. Whitaker was a seasoned attorney, sharp, intelligent, and ruthless, known for bending the law to protect those in power, even when the truth didn't fit their narrative. The thought of facing her in court, someone who had built her career on defending the system at all costs, made Amelia's blood boil. Her first court appearance came faster than she anticipated. As she walked into the courtroom, the chill in the air was palpable. She held her head high, projecting calm, but inside, everything was on fire. This wasn't just another day in a courtroom. This was the beginning of her fight, the first real test of whether she could truly take down a system that had been working against her for so long. The real battle had only just begun. Sitting in front of her was Judge Richard Nolan, the same judge who had dismissed her complaint without so much as a glance at the evidence she had painstakingly gathered. His cold, sharp gaze swept across the room, never meeting her eyes directly, as though he was already certain of the outcome. He had failed her once, and now here he was again, presiding over her trial, deciding her fate. The irony wasn't lost on her. This wasn't justice. It was a calculated power play, a game they had been playing long before she walked into that courtroom. Across the room, Tate and Ross sat side by side in the front row, their smug faces betraying their confidence. They were already convinced of their victory, of their absolute control over the situation. They thought they had already won. They had played this game for years, making victims out of people like Amelia and never once worrying about any consequences. Ross even shot her a grin, a look that screamed, "You don't stand a chance," the kind of grin that reminded her just how deep this corruption ran. Amelia took a deep breath and made her way toward the defendant's table. She was determined, but this was no ordinary moment. This was the moment she would prove them all wrong. She had stood in this courtroom before, many times, as a prosecutor fighting for justice. But this was different. This time, she was the one being judged. This time, She was the one on the receiving end of a system that was meant to protect her, but had turned against her instead. It wasn't just the familiar faces that made this different. It was the overwhelming sense of how stacked the odds were against her. The system was rigged, and she knew it. But despite it all, Amelia was resolute. She had made it this far, and she wasn't about to back down now. They underestimated her. They thought they could crush her with their charges, with their smirks, with their whispered threats. But they didn't know her. They didn't know what she was capable of when she was backed into a corner. She sat at the table, her posture firm, eyes straight ahead, but her mind raced. She thought about the people who had been victimized by officers like Tate and Ross, those whose complaints were dismissed, their voices silenced by the system that was supposed to protect them. She thought about the homeless woman who had witnessed it all, who had seen the abuse for years but had never had the power to stop it. Amelia knew that for every person who had suffered at the hands of these officers, there were thousands more who had been crushed under the weight of the system. She couldn't let this happen again. Amelia's eyes flicked back to Tate and Ross. They were sitting there, as confident as ever, believing that their years of manipulating the system had made them untouchable. But Amelia knew that if she didn't stand up now, no one ever would. The trial began. Whitaker stood up first, her voice dripping with condescension as she addressed the court. She was already framing the narrative, painting Amelia as a dangerous individual who had provoked the officers, resisting arrest, making it all sound like some routine conflict gone wrong. Amelia could feel her jaw tightening with every word, the injustice of it all searing her from within. But she didn't react. She couldn't afford to. Then it was Amelia's turn. Her defense wasn't a story of victimhood. It was a call for justice, a reminder of what she stood for. She could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her, knowing that every word she said could be twisted, misrepresented. But she didn't care. She spoke with fire in her voice, her words unwavering as she laid out the truth. Tate and Ross were the ones who had broken the law, who had twisted the system to suit their own needs. And now they were trying to destroy her for daring to fight back. Amelia's eyes burned with determination as she addressed the court. This isn't just about me. This is about the countless others who have been silenced, crushed by the very people who were supposed to protect them. The room grew still. Tate and Ross shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But Amelia didn't look at them. She kept her focus on the judge, the jury, the court, and most importantly, the people who were too afraid to speak up. This was no longer just her fight. It was theirs too. Amelia stood tall, knowing that she wasn't just fighting for herself, but for everyone who had been pushed aside, ignored, and forgotten. This battle wasn't over yet, and no matter how hard they tried to bring her down, she would never stop fighting. Amelia sat down at the defendant's table, her eyes fixed on Judge Richard Nolan. She knew he wouldn't give her a fair trial. He had shown that when he dismissed her complaint without so much as reviewing it. Now, as he sat in the high chair, his cold eyes and indifferent expression, she could see more clearly than ever that she was up against a system that didn't want to be shaken. Caroline Whitaker, the prosecutor in the case, stepped up to the podium. Her voice rang out with confidence. Defendant Amelia Carter not only resisted a lawful order from the police, but also obstructed the course of justice. She exhibited aggressive behavior, refused to cooperate, and even threatened officers Ross and Tate. Amelia ground her teeth. Every word from Whitaker was a direct assault on the truth. But she couldn't lose control. She had to remain calm. Miss Carter, Judge Nolan said, his voice flat. Do you have any evidence to counter these charges? This was her moment. Amelia took a deep breath and stood up. Your Honor, I have a video from a witness proving that I did not resist. I also have testimonies from several other witnesses, including a woman who saw the entire incident. Nolan didn't blink. Do you have this video with you? I do. Amelia replied, her eyes flashing with hope. She handed the USB drive containing the video to her defense attorney, Stella Morano, and she moved forward to present the evidence. But before Stella could say anything, Nolan raised his hand. This evidence will not be accepted, he declared. Amelia felt as if a bucket of cold water had been thrown in her face. Why? Nolan crossed his arms, his gaze as cold as steel. This is a video from an anonymous witness, which may have been edited. We cannot rely on such a vague video to assess the actions of the police. A wave of fury surged in Amelia's chest. He hadn't even watched the video. He had dismissed it outright. But, Your Honor, Stella spoke up, trying to keep her voice calm. This is a direct video from the scene. The witness can be called to testify to verify this. Nolan shook his head. I won't waste time on evidence lacking credibility. Proceed. Amelia sat back down, her hands clenched tightly. She could feel the helplessness rising within her, but she wouldn't let herself be drowned in it. This was exactly what Nolan wanted. He wanted her to feel isolated, to feel like she couldn't win. But she would not give him that satisfaction. On the prosecution's side, Whitaker gestured for Tate to step up to the witness stand. He confidently moved to the front, adjusted his uniform collar, and began speaking in a tone so self-assured it made Amelia nauseous. When I ordered the defendant out of the car, she immediately became uncooperative. She questioned my command, refused to follow instructions, and became agitated. Ross nodded, adding, she even raised her voice at us, drawing the attention of passers-by and deliberately causing a disturbance. When we requested to search the vehicle, she continued to refuse, and her behavior became increasingly aggressive. Amelia felt every lie they spoke cut into her like knives. They were weaving the perfect story, a story that could convince anyone who didn't know the truth. She glanced around the courtroom, seeing a few people nodding along with Tate and Ross's testimony. They knew how to manipulate the truth. They had done this before. Nolan didn't interrupt. He let them speak, letting them manipulate the trial without asking a single question. When Tate and Ross finished their testimony, Whitaker turned to Nolan. Your Honor, with the clear testimony from two professionally trained police officers, I believe we have sufficient grounds to conclude that the defendant engaged in resisting arrest. Nolan nodded slowly. I agree. But to be fair, we will allow the defendant to speak in her defense. His words held no trace of fairness, but Amelia knew this was the moment she had to speak. If they thought she would stay silent, they were wrong. She had come too far to stop now. Amelia stood up, walking slowly toward the witness stand. She could feel the mocking glares of Tate and Ross following her, the smugness of Whitaker as she thought everything was already under control. But Amelia was no pawn to be easily knocked down. She took a deep breath, keeping her voice steady as she answered the questions from her defense attorney. I fully cooperated throughout the search, she said clearly. I did not resist. I did not raise my voice. I only asked why I was being stopped. I have the right to ask that. Whitaker snickered and shook her head. Miss Carter, I'm afraid your words carry less weight than the sworn testimony of two officers who have dedicated their lives to upholding the law. Amelia gritted her teeth. Then why not consider the evidence? If I was really resisting, why is there no video from the police camera? Nolan lightly tapped his fingers on the judge's podium, his eyes betraying his irritation. I've already made it clear that we don't have any valid video to use as evidence. Suddenly, a sharp click echoed from the back of the courtroom. Everyone turned to see a man walk in, holding a small USB drive. He was dressed in a dark suit, his expression serious, his sharp eyes scanning the room. Amelia recognized him immediately. James Holloway, an internal investigator she had worked with in the past. James walked straight to Amelia's defense table, unbothered by the surprised glances around the room. Apologies for the interruption, he said in a deep, authoritative voice. But I have some important evidence to present. Whitaker frowned, stepping forward. Who are you? James pulled a file from his briefcase and slammed it onto the table. Internal investigator from the Federal Inspector General's office. And I have video footage from the traffic camera showing the entire incident that morning. A shock wave rippled through the courtroom. Whitaker blinked, struggling to keep her composure. And where did you get this evidence? James smirked. From the city's own storage system. What's surprising is that this video should have been submitted to the defense, but somehow it was forgotten in the data vault. He turned to Nolan. Your Honor, I request that this video be shown immediately. Nolan clenched his jaw. He knew that rejecting this would only further expose his bias. He motioned for the court technician. Play it. The large screen in the center of the courtroom flickered to life. The image was sharp and clear. Amelia sitting in her car, hands on the steering wheel, her face calm as Tate approached. She handed over her documents without any sign of resistance. Then Ross appeared, searching her vehicle without just cause. Finally, the scene of Ross roughly pushing her into the car and conducting a harsh search made the entire courtroom feel tense beyond belief. There was complete silence. Nolan's face lost color. Whitaker bit her lip. Tate and Ross were frozen, realizing that the tables had completely turned. Amelia looked around the courtroom, noticing the shift in the faces of the onlookers from skepticism to horror. She turned back to Tate and Ross, her voice heavy with meaning. So, who is really obstructing justice here? Judge Nolan stared intently at the screen, his jaw tightening as the video came to an end. The courtroom was shrouded in tense silence. Tate and Ross sat motionless, realizing that their web of lies had just been exposed for everyone to see. Amelia held her breath, waiting for Nolan's response. This was undeniable evidence. Clear visuals, authentic sound, no signs of resistance from her. This video should have been enough to dismiss all charges and even launch an investigation in reverse. But Nolan only needed a few seconds to regain his composure. He leaned on the table, interlaced his fingers, and spoke slowly in a terrifyingly calm voice. I'm afraid this video cannot be accepted as evidence. The courtroom shook with shock. Stella jumped to her feet. Your Honor, this is an official recording from the city's traffic system. There are no signs of tampering, and it directly contradicts the testimonies of these two officers. Nolan shrugged, his gaze fleetingly landing on Amelia with an unreadable look. The video may have been altered or may not reflect the full context. We cannot base a decision on a single clip to overturn the testimony of two highly respected officers. Amelia clenched her fists. He had made his decision long before. Nothing would change the outcome now. Despite the video clearly showing the truth, Nolan brazenly rejected it. He no longer hid his bias. He didn't need to pretend to be objective because he believed he was part of an untouchable power structure. Amelia knew she couldn't win in this courtroom. But if the system denied justice, she would find another way to bring the truth to light. Amelia stood motionless in the courtroom, her heart pounding, but not out of fear. Rather, because of the fury igniting within her. They had dismissed undeniable evidence right in front of her, in front of everyone, as if the truth held no value in this room. She glanced at Stella, still stunned by Nolan's blatant decision, while Whitaker wore a smug, victorious smile. In that moment, Amelia realized something. She couldn't win in a game they had rigged from the start. But if they denied the truth in this courtroom, she would take that truth to the world. Her hand tightened around the phone in her jacket pocket. She couldn't let this case be buried like the others before it. She couldn't let Tate and Ross continue to abuse their power without facing consequences. If the system protected them, she would create a wave strong enough to shatter that system. She turned to Stella, her voice low but resolute. We need to get out of here. Stella understood immediately. There was no reason to stay in this trial any longer. Justice would not exist here. They gathered their documents, stepping out of the courtroom, leaving a suffocating atmosphere behind. Before they left, Amelia glanced one last time at Tate and Ross. Both still wore self-satisfied expressions, but she knew something. They wouldn't be so confident for long. As soon as they stepped out of the courthouse, Amelia and Stella hurried to the parking lot. Neither of them spoke, but both knew the real fight was just beginning. Amelia sat in the car, her eyes glued to her phone screen. Her fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard, each letter appearing on the screen. When the justice system is manipulated, justice can only be found where the truth is free to speak. This is the video they don't want you to see. She uploaded the video to social media, attaching the full story, the absurdity of the charges against her, how Nolan rejected irrefutable evidence, and the dark history of Tate and Ross. Within minutes, her post started attracting hundreds of shares. People began to take notice. Less than an hour later, her phone began buzzing relentlessly with a flood of messages and calls. The media reached out, human rights activists started reporting, and angry comments flooded beneath the post. Hashtags like "Justice for Amelia," "Nolan must pay," and "corrupt system" quickly spread. The system Nolan and those behind him tried to protect was now under the spotlight of public scrutiny. But Amelia also knew this meant she had officially declared war on the dark forces behind the system, and they would not let her go easily. At midnight, as Amelia checked the latest news, a strange call appeared on her phone screen. She stared at the anonymous number, her senses on high alert. After a brief hesitation, she answered. The voice on the other end was deep, slow, and laced with danger. "Miss Carter? I have some advice for you." Amelia gripped the phone tightly. "Who is this?" The man chuckled absently. You don't need to know who I am. But I need you to understand that you've gone too far. You're meddling with a force you can't even begin to imagine. A cold shiver ran down Amelia's spine. What force? I can only say this. The man's voice dropped, turning more serious. What you're doing won't just put you in danger. It will pull everyone around you into this. And those in the shadows show no mercy, Miss Carter. If you continue, there will be no turning back. She took a deep breath. If you're trying to threaten me, forget it. I'm not afraid. The man on the other end of the line chuckled softly, but it wasn't a cheerful laugh. It was the laugh of someone who knew he held a stronger card. We're not threatening you. We're just warning you. You'll realize that soon enough. The call ended abruptly, leaving Amelia frozen, listening to the cold, distant beeping echo in the silent room. This was no longer just a legal battle. She had just entered a war with forces she couldn't see, but she could feel their presence. And if she wasn't careful, they could destroy her before she even had the chance to act. Amelia sat in her apartment, the light from her laptop screen casting a pale glow on her face. On the screen, the numbers were rising by the second. Millions of views, hundreds of thousands of comments, and an unprecedented wave of outrage sweeping across social media platforms. She hadn't just sparked a simple debate. She had ignited a fire that no one could extinguish. Messages flooded in constantly, from strangers expressing their support, from human rights organizations offering assistance, and from reporters wanting to interview her immediately. But among them, there was one message that made her freeze. You think you've won? The game has only just begun. Be careful, Amelia Carter. No phone number, no identity, just a cold message like a warning from the darkness. She felt the danger closing in. The forces in the shadows wouldn't sit idly by and watch everything collapse. She had forced the system to reveal itself, and now they wouldn't stop until they silenced her. A sharp knock echoed from the window. Amelia startled, turning her head. An envelope, black as night, had been slipped through the crack in the door. She slowly walked over, her heart racing, as she opened the envelope. Inside was just a short note with 3 scrolled words, "Don't go too far." A cold shiver ran down her spine. Amelia took a deep breath, gripping the paper tightly in her hand. If this was their way of threatening her, they had picked the wrong person. She had gone too far to turn back now. She picked up her phone and called Marcus. "I think we've just poked the bear." There was silence on the other end for a moment. Then Marcus's voice came through, low and grave. "I know. And we need to prepare, Amelia. The real battle has only just begun." Outside the window, the city hummed with life, but Amelia knew that from this moment on, she was no longer the only one watching this fight.